Imagine a high-ranking Tier 1 commander, a man who has seen the darkest corners of the Earth, stopping a massive military convoy just to salute a low-level supply clerk. To the 100 soldiers watching, it's a glitch in the Matrix. To them, she's just the butterfly, a girl who spends her days with clipboards and supply manifests. But as the commander's hand hits his brow, a terrifying question hangs in the desert heat. What did this clerk do in the shadows that earned the respect of the world's deadliest men? The air at Outpost Zero doesn't just shimmer. It vibrates with a dry, metallic heat that tastes like pulverized rock and diesel exhaust. Imagine standing in a line for 40 minutes while the sun drills into your skull, the dust grinding between your teeth like glass. This is the daily reality for Specialist Sarah Thorne. To the infantrymen surrounding her, she is a non-entity, a fobbit who lives behind a desk, surrounded by the rhythmic scratching of pens and the dull thud of rubber stamps. Thorne stood in the chow line, her spine a straight line of disciplined iron. Her sleeves were rolled precisely 2 inches above the wrist, exposing the ink that had made her a target of ridicule since she arrived. A single black ink butterfly. In a world of combat patches, infantry blue, and scars earned in the mountains, that butterfly looked like a fragile joke. Think about the psychological weight of that silence. Would you have the strength to let a room full of warriors laugh at your expense, knowing you held a secret that could level the base? Check it out. A voice cut through the heat, sharp and jagged. A group of grunts behind her leaned against the sun-baked dirt, their eyes tracking the ink on her forearm. "Hey, Thorne, what's the plan for the next op? You gonna flutter at the enemy until they die of cuteness?" The laughter didn't just ripple. It broke over her like a wave of static. Thorne didn't flinch. Her knuckles didn't whiten on her tray, and her breathing remained shallow and controlled. She kept her eyes locked on the back of the soldier in front of her, her face a mask of absolute neutrality. To them, her silence was weakness. To Thorne, it was a tactical necessity. The ridicule followed her to the motor pool later that afternoon. The smell of grease and hot rubber hung heavy in the shade of the maintenance bays. The base commander had ordered a surprise inspection, and the atmosphere was thick with the scent of cold sweat and nervous energy. "Specialist Thorne, step up," a lieutenant barked, his voice echoing off the corrugated metal. He held an M4 carbine like a challenge. "Logistics thinks they're soldiers because they wear the same boots. Let's see if you can do more than file a manifest. Disassemble, now." The soldiers gathered around, a wall of judging eyes. They expected her to fumble. They expected the butterfly to break a nail. Instead, Thorne reached into her pocket and pulled out a dark strip of cloth. Without a word, she tied it over her eyes. The motor pool went deathly silent, the only sound the distant, rhythmic thumping of a generator. Her hands moved. It wasn't a mechanical process, it was a symphony of muscle memory. The metallic clack slide of the bolt carrier group, the sharp tink of the firing pin hitting the table. She didn't search for the parts. She knew exactly where they were in space and time. Piece by piece, the weapon was laid bare on the grease-stained table in less than 90 seconds. When she finished the reassembly, the final click of the magazine seated into the well sounded like a gunshot in the quiet. She pulled the blindfold off, her eyes burning with a brief, hidden fire, before she looked back at her clipboard. "It's all in the manual, sir," she said softly. But the questions were starting to boil beneath the surface. How does a clerk possess the blindfolded speed of a Tier 1 operator? Why does she have coordinates woven into the wings of a fragile tattoo? As the sun began to dip, casting long, ghostly shadows across the yard, the ground began to vibrate. A convoy of blacked-out vehicles rolled through the gates, layers of desert dust coating their armored hulls. These weren't standard army units. These were men who lived in the black, a Navy SEAL detachment rotating through for a mission no one was allowed to talk about. The lead vehicle stopped. A commander stepped out, his face etched with the exhaustion of 1,000 sleepless nights. He began to scan the yard, his eyes hard and clinical. Then he saw her. Thorne was standing by the supply crates, her sleeves rolled up, the butterfly visible in the harsh glare of the floodlights. The commander froze. His entire posture shifted, the weariness vanishing, replaced by a shock so profound it felt like a physical blow. He didn't walk toward her. He marched. The soldiers who had spent all week mocking Thorne watched in stunned silence as the most dangerous man on the base stopped directly in front of the clerk. The commander didn't say a word. He snapped his boots together and brought his hand to his brow in a razor-sharp ceremonial salute. The air in the yard vanished. The laughter, the jokes, the mockery, it all died in that second. Because a SEAL commander doesn't salute a specialist, he salutes a superior, or a legend. The salute hung in the air like a lightning bolt frozen in time. At Outpost Zero, the world stopped spinning. The grinding gears of the motor pool, the clatter of metal trays in the distance, the low hum of idling engines, it all vanished into a vacuum of pure, suffocating silence. Imagine the psychological whiplash hitting the soldiers nearby. One moment, they were snickering at a fragile clerk. The next, they were watching a Tier 1 commander, a man with the weight of 100 secret wars on his shoulders, standing at rigid attention for her. Specialist Sarah Thorne didn't move. Her fingers gripped her clipboard so tightly the plastic grooved against her skin. Her breathing was shallow, a rhythmic, controlled effort to keep her internal walls from crumbling. This was the nightmare she had traded her career to avoid: being seen. The commander's eyes weren't looking at her rank. They were locked onto the black ink butterfly on her forearm. "You're still with us, Viper?" The commander's voice was low, carrying the gravel of a man who had screamed into the wind of too many firefights. Thorne gave the smallest, almost imperceptible nod. Around them, the atmosphere shifted from confusion to a cold, creeping dread. The men who had mocked her in the chow line felt the air grow heavy, their own breaths catching in their throats as they realized they hadn't just been bullying a clerk. They had been mocking a ghost. Think about the weight of that silence. How does it feel to realize the person you've been treating like a ghost is actually the person who keeps the ghosts at bay? The commander finally lowered his hand and turned his gaze toward the gathered infantrymen. His eyes were sharp enough to draw blood. "You think she's a joke?" he asked, his voice a low vibration that seemed to rattle the very foundations of the warehouse. "You think that ink is a decoration?" He stepped into the center of the formation, his presence dwarfing the soldiers who had, only hours ago, joked about Thorne breaking a nail. "Years ago, in a valley that doesn't exist on your maps, we were dead men," the commander began, his voice dropping into a register of grim memory. "Outnumbered, pinned against a rock face with the sun going down and the thermal batteries dying. We were minutes from being overrun, waiting for a final stand that none of us were going to win." He pointed a gloved finger at Thorne, who stood like a statue in the dust. The revelation didn't come with a bang, but with a slow, agonizing realization. Thorne hadn't been on the front lines with a rifle. She had been the eye in the sky, an embedded intelligence officer whose job was to see through the fog of war when everyone else was blinded by it. She was the one who processed the data, the one who found the needle-thin extraction path through a mountain range crawling with enemies. She hadn't pulled a trigger. She had pulled an entire team back from the edge of the abyss. But as the commander spoke, the butterfly tattoo began to take on a terrifying new meaning. It wasn't just a call sign. It was a mark of sacrifice. Whispers began to circulate among the SEAL detachment, bits of black tier history that were never meant to leave the vault. They looked at the thin lines weaving through the wings of the butterfly, the coordinates and unit digits that the infantrymen had ignored. Those weren't random numbers. They were the locations of the fallen. Thorne's throat tightened. Her jaw locked so hard it ached. She didn't want this tribute. She had chosen the logistics division, the clipboards, and the silence specifically to bury the memory of that valley. She had traded her status for a quiet life in the shadows, far away from the life and death decisions that cost her everything. The commander stepped closer to her, his expression softening just enough for her to see the shared trauma in his eyes. "The world thinks we did it alone," he said, loud enough for every soldier in the yard to hear. "But they don't know about the voice in the dark. They don't know about the butterfly." Suddenly, the commander's hand moved to his belt. He didn't pull a weapon. He pulled a small, scorched piece of fabric, a patch from a unit that officially never existed. He laid it on the supply crate next to Thorne's clipboard. The soldiers watched, hearts hammering against their ribs. The reality was cracking open. The girl they called a coward was the only reason the men they idolized were still breathing. "Tell them, Viper," the commander whispered, a challenge and a plea all at once. "Tell them about the night the radio went silent." Thorne looked at the scorched patch, then at the horizon where the sun was beginning to bleed into the dust sea. The silence was no longer her defense. It was her prison. If she speaks, the mission stays alive, but her quiet life ends forever. If she stays silent, the truth dies with the men in that valley. What would you choose? The commander leaned in, his voice barely audible over the rising wind. "They're still out there, Sarah, and you're the only one who knows the way back." The desert wind began to howl, a mournful sound that echoed through the skeletal structures of Outpost Zero. As the commander stood there, the scorched patch lying between them, the present day started to dissolve. Imagine the sensory shift. The smell of diesel fuel at the outpost replaced by the sharp metallic scent of ozone and wet earth. We are no longer in the safety of a logistics hub. We are moving back in time, to a jagged mountain pass known only as the Iron Corridor. Sarah Thorne, then known by her call sign, Viper, wasn't sitting behind a desk with a clipboard. She was hunched over a glowing terminal in the back of a moving command vehicle, the rhythmic thumping of helicopter blades vibrating through her chest. Her world was a chaotic storm of green screen data and frantic radio bursts. While the Tier 1 team on the ground moved through the shadows of the valley, Thorne was their god mode, the eye in the sky who could see the heat signatures they couldn't. Think about the pressure of holding a dozen lives in your fingertips. One wrong digit, one missed sensor sweep, and the men you've grown to call brothers become nothing but statistics. What would you do in the silence of a failing radio link? The ambush didn't start with a bang. It started with a dead zone. On Thorne's screen, the blue icons representing the SEAL team suddenly flickered and froze. The Iron Corridor was a natural Faraday cage, and the enemy knew it. Down in the valley, the commander and his team were walking into a kill zone. Thorne's breathing became shallow, her pulse hammering against her throat as she watched red heat signatures, hundreds of them, blossom on the ridges above her team. The team was pinned against a sheer rock face, their thermal batteries dying in the freezing mountain air. On the ground, the commander gripped his rifle until his knuckles turned white, his ears ringing with the relentless thrum crack of incoming fire. They were minutes from being wiped out. The extraction birds were 5 minutes out, but they were flying blind into a wall of anti-aircraft fire. Thorne had a choice that would violate every standing protocol of her intelligence mandate. She could stay silent and follow the chain of command, or she could break the encryption, hijack a local satellite, and guide them out herself, but doing so meant exposing her digital footprint to the enemy and to her own superiors. It was a choice between her career and their lives. In the flickering light of her terminal, Thorne's fingers moved with that same blindfolded precision the soldiers at Outpost Zero had seen earlier. She cracked the local cellular grid, her jaw tight, sweat stinging her eyes as she bypassed military firewalls. She didn't just find a route. She found a ghost path, a narrow drainage pipe beneath the valley floor that didn't appear on any modern map. "Viper to lead," she whispered into the headset, her voice the only thing keeping the commander's heart from stopping in the dark. "Turn 90 degrees east. There is a breach in the rock." "Move now or you don't move at all." She watched the blue icons begin to move, a desperate crawl through the mud and shadows. But the cost was already being calculated. By hijacking the satellite, Thorne had illuminated herself. Back at the command center, the alarms were already screaming. She was being flagged for unauthorized access to top-secret assets. The mission was a success. The team lived, but as the sun rose over the iron corridor, Thorne was met not with a medal, but with a transition team in black suits. To protect the secrecy of the illegal satellite hijack, Thorne was to be erased. No records, no commendations, and a one-way ticket to a logistics desk at a dead-end outpost. Back at Outpost Zero, the commander looked at Thorne with a depth of respect that bordered on reverence. The infantrymen watching felt the weight of their own shame like a physical leaden coat. They had mocked the woman who had sacrificed everything to be a ghost so that others could come home. The commander stepped closer, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper that barely carried over the wind. "The mission in the valley. It was never actually over, Sarah." Thorne's grip on her clipboard finally broke, the plastic snapping with a sharp crack. She looked at the scorched patch, then back at the commander. "They found the encrypted cache, didn't they?" she asked, her voice trembling for the first time. The commander didn't answer with words. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, handheld transmitter. It was pulsing with a rhythmic, ghostly green light, a distress signal from a frequency that had been dead for 3 years. The signal wasn't coming from the past. It was coming from the iron corridor, and it was addressed to Viper. The flickering green light of the transmitter pulsed against the backdrop of Outpost Zero, casting rhythmic, sickly shadows across Specialist Sarah Thorne's face. Imagine the absolute sensory overload, the mechanical hum of a base that thinks it's at peace, suddenly punctured by a ghost signal from a dead war. Thorne's shallow breathing hitching in her chest as she stared at the device. The transmitter wasn't just a piece of hardware, it was a digital screaming match with a past she had been ordered to forget. "It's been 3 years," she whispered, her voice barely a thread in the wind. Her fingers, usually so steady with a clipboard, trembled as she reached for the device. The commander's grip on the transmitter was firm, his own knuckles white, his eyes never leaving hers. He wasn't just bringing her news. He was bringing her back to the edge of the abyss. Think about the impossible weight of that realization. You've sacrificed your identity, your career, and your pride to keep a secret buried, only to find out the secret has been digging its way out the entire time. What do you do when the silence you've used as armor suddenly becomes your greatest enemy? The scene shifted in the collective memory of those standing in the yard. Back in the iron corridor, the mission hadn't just been an ambush. It was a labyrinth. Thorne, then Viper, had been the only one who could see the walls. While the SEAL team was pinned down, their ears ringing from the concussive force of mortar fire, Thorne was fighting a different kind of war. She wasn't holding a rifle. She was holding a fragment of a broken code. The enemy had used a shifting encryption, a digital shell game that changed every 60 seconds. To find the extraction path, Thorne had to navigate a literal death trap of data. She didn't have a map. She had to build one in real time, while the command center alarms shrieked in her ears, accusing her of treason for every firewall she bypassed. Every click of her keyboard was a gamble with the lives of the men in that valley. She had found the drainage pipe, the ghost path, but the exit was sealed by a remote detonated bulkhead. To open it, she had to stay connected to the enemy's local grid long after her location was compromised. She sat in that command trailer, the smell of ozone and hot circuitry filling her lungs, watching the countdown. She knew that by the time the bulkhead opened and her team slid into the safety of the dark, the black suit transition teams would already be outside her door. She chose the team. She opened the gate. And then, she went silent. Back at Outpost Zero, the commander stepped closer, the transmitter's pulse speeding up. "They didn't just find the cache, Sarah. They found the logs you left behind, the ones you thought were erased." The infantrymen who had mocked her for her butterfly garden tattoo now stood like statues. The laughter had been replaced by a crushing, leaden guilt. They saw the ink on her arm now for what it truly was, a map of the survivors, a ledger of the lives she had bought with her own anonymity. The butterfly wasn't a decoration, it was a memorial. Thorne took the transmitter. As her thumb brushed the interface, the screen bled into a new sequence. It wasn't a distress call. It was a set of coordinates, fresh, active, and moving. They were within 100 miles of the outpost. "They're not just coming for the cache, are they?" Thorne asked, her voice hardening, the clerk mask finally shattering to reveal the viper underneath. The commander shook his head, his face a mask of grim finality. "They're coming for the only person left who can decrypt the final phase. They're coming for you." Just then, the base sirens began to wail. Not the rhythmic drill tone, but the long, low-frequency moan of an incoming threat. The horizon of the dust sea was no longer empty. A cloud of black silhouettes was fast approaching, moving with a speed that shouldn't be possible for local forces. The ghost of the Iron Corridor hadn't just sent a message. It had brought the war to her front door. The low-frequency moan of the base sirens didn't just signal a threat. It vibrated through the marrow of Sarah Thorne's bones. At Outpost Zero, the heat of the day was being swallowed by a cold, aggressive wind that smelled of ionized dust and impending lightning. The soldiers who had spent months treating Thorne like a ghost now looked at her as if she were a miracle, or a target. Imagine the psychological shift in that yard. The butterfly clerk, the woman they had mocked in the chow line and laughed at in the motor pool, was suddenly the only person standing between them and a shadow they couldn't even name. Thorne didn't panic. She didn't shout orders. Her breathing remained rhythmic, her face a mask of cold, analytical precision. As the black silhouettes on the horizon drew closer, she turned to the SEAL commander. The Viper wasn't just back. She was in command of the data. "Sir, if they're using the shifting encryption from the corridor, your comms will be dead in 30 seconds, she said, her voice barely a whisper, but carrying the weight of an executioner's blade. Think about the silence of a battlefield when the technology fails. What would you do if your only lifeline was a voice on a radio that everyone else told you to ignore? The commander didn't hesitate. He turned to the assembled troops, the same men who had once sarcastically clapped when Thorne dropped a tray. You heard the specialist, he barked, his voice cutting through the siren's wail. If you want to live through the night, you look at her. You listen to her, because she's the only one who has ever seen this enemy and lived to tell about it. One by one, the soldiers who had once whispered about her fragile tattoo snapped to attention. Boots clicked against the parched earth with a sound like a hammer strike. The mockery was dead, buried under the weight of a respect that had finally found its mark. Thorne didn't smile. She didn't seek the validation. She simply stepped back to her desk, but she didn't pick up a clipboard. She pulled an encrypted terminal from a hidden compartment, a piece of gear that had been waiting in the dark for 3 years. I'm just doing my job, sir, she said softly, her fingers already dancing across the keys with the blindfolded speed of a ghost. The final phase of the decryption began to crawl across the screen, a sequence of numbers and coordinates that mapped out the true history of the Iron Corridor. The truth was finally cracking open, but it didn't bring peace. It brought the realization that Thorne had never been just a clerk. She had been a sentry, standing watch over a secret that was now knocking on the gate. As the first wave of the unknown force reached the outer perimeter, the SEAL operators and the Army officers stood in a solid wall of iron, their hands raised in a final, crisp salute to the woman at the terminal. It was a moment stretched tight with the gravity of sacrifice. The butterfly ink on her arm wasn't a joke anymore. It was a banner of survival. Thorne looked at the screen, then at a single, sealed letter on her desk, one she had written long ago but never mailed. It was addressed to a name that had been lost in the valley. She picked up her pen, added one final line, and then turned back to the digital war. The legend of Sarah Thorne was no longer a whisper at Outpost Zero. It was the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. True strength isn't loud. It's the quietest warrior who carries the deepest scars and the highest honors. Thorne stayed at her post long after the sirens stopped, her light burning late into the night, her silence her only witness. If you found strength in the story of the quietest warrior among us, don't forget to show your support. Subscribe for more true tales of courage and the heroes who walk beside us, unnoticed until the world needs them most.